Megillat Ruth. Of course, when I say that, my computer actually starts to respond. That's all it was waiting for. I want to thank Dan and Ilan Rubenstein for dedicating the year's Megillah classes, and everybody who's been a part of the series for Esther, as well as those who are just joining us now. This is going to be a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to learning this Megillah with you. I am assuming some basic familiarity with the story. For those who have not read it before, it's just 85 sentences. So really, it's a good idea to just read through it quickly. There is an outline of it on the sheet that we'll get to below, and that should help as well. But I want to begin by talking about why this is such a great book to learn in depth. This is a story in which it's really easy to get so caught up in the figures and in the story that we miss important aspects of it. Ruth herself is a dramatic figure who's... someone there needs to mute there, thank you. Ruth herself is a dramatic figure whose life resonates for people in a lot of different ways. And I brought you on the sheet a collection of some of the things that people have said about Ruth and about her story, which I think will really capture what I'm trying to get at here in terms of the remarkable nature of this story. Take a look, please, at source number 1. This is from Professor Phyllis Tribble, an article entitled "Two Women in a Man's World, a Reading of the Book of Ruth." And she actually published this in a couple of other places after, but this, I think, is the first place where she wrote this. She says, "A man's world tells a woman's story," meaning she's describing the Book of Ruth. "With consummate artistry, the Book of Ruth presents the aged Naomi and the youthful Ruth as they struggle for survival in a patriarchal environment. These women bear their own burdens. They know hardship, danger, insecurity, and death. No God promises them blessing. No man rushes to their rescue. They themselves risk bold decisions and shocking acts." And now I see, hang on, that I'm actually back online. So I'm going to kill the phone. There we go. They themselves risk bold... Oh, now I'm muted. Let's try that again. They themselves risk bold decisions and shocking acts to work out their own salvation in the midst of the alien, the hostile, and the unknown. One female has chosen another female in a world whose life depends on men. There is no more radical decision in all the memories of Israel. It's really a remarkable take on the book. For me, it brought to light certain things which I hadn't really thought of before. What's your reaction when you read this first paragraph?
It's something that's always resonated for me about Ruth. It's as a woman reading the Torah, there aren't a lot, and then all the other ramifications of the book and what they do in terms of Jewish history, as a young woman, but even as you get older, it always spoke to me about possibility, and with a very large message. Okay, but I'll just leave it at that and let somebody else.
Okay. I actually thought about these two women in a men's world. I thought about Megillat Esther.
So we're going to talk about the relationship between Ruth and Esther because there are things to be said about connecting the two of them. I thought about starting that way because it would be a nice way to connect what we've been learning and where we're going, but it'll fit in later on. But it's two women in a man's world, and the two women in Esther don't end up talking to each other. The women in Esther are at different times. They're not in conversation, which is an important element. Jeanette, who had her hand up, and then Susan, who has a real hand up.
So I just thought it's not anything profound, but I'm one of those women who I'm never disturbed by any feminist ideas within Yiddishkeit. I've always felt that I don't see M.Torczyner anymore.
I'm here.
I've always felt you're here. Okay. I've always felt that within the context of history, that Jewish women are very powerful. And, in other words, I know I'm different from most women in that and she doesn't. So even from my point of view, I find this an incredibly powerful opening way to look at it. I really do.
I want to note, just having nothing to do with the content of what Jeanette just said, but I was going to say it later, but I'm going to throw it in now. There will be people who say Ruth, there will be people who say Root, there will be people who say Rus. I am probably going to go back and forth among all of them. We're all talking about the same person to make that. And once we're doing that, there's another name that should be clarified, and I'm going to clarify it now as well. And then I'll go to Susan, and then Rebecca. And that is the name Naomi. It's written here Naomi. People look at it in the text and are often confused because it looks like it's Naomi. The truth of the matter is, it's Naomi. And the reason for that is something that they didn't teach me in elementary school. I don't know if they taught you. I suspect Janine knows with her grammar focus. And that's the kamatz katan. The kamatz is the T-shaped vowel found under the letter. There are two kinds of kamatz. There's the kamatz, and then there's the kamatz katan. And we're not going into all the rules right now for discerning whether it's a kamatz or it's a kamatz katan, but a kamatz katan is pronounced almost like an O. It's a really deep O sound. And that's what you find under the ayin in Naomi. So her name pronounced properly is Naomi, which becomes Naomi. So that's why it's always rendered as Naomi in English, even though it looks like Naomi in Hebrew. Side note, but worth noting. Susan.
When you look at, I look at it also as, besides being a religious book, it's a book that appeals to other peoples. And we, lots of times we talk about a book if it's got, that the author, you can feel the author is male or female. And what I found when I did Ruth over the years, that there were parts of it that actually had a proper female tone to it, which is unusual, especially at that time, of a book written by Shmuel. So he was able to, at times, catch the feminine in his protagonist.
That's really interesting. When we get to a part of the book where you see that, could you share that? Because I don't have the ear for that, obviously. So I would be very interested to hear, where in the book you see that. Okay, thank you. Rebecca, and then Chana. And then there's a lot more to see. I only brought this because I thought it was a really interesting way to look at it and an enlightening way for me. So I brought it to start with, but we have a lot more to see along the way. Rebecca?
I just wanted to add, and not to politicize, but it's very important that she talks about it in a life that depends on men. Root, in our story, has the option of doing an incredibly demeaning and an act that could blow up in her face when she goes to the threshing floor in the middle of the night. I mean, a shocking thing for a woman to do. We can find modern equivalents.
We're going to talk about it.
It could have gone all wrong, and it could have been, all kinds of things. The hundreds and probably thousands of women who are gunot today don't have that option. They still live in a man's world, and they are still chained because of recalcitrant husbands. So I just...
Understood.
It does speak to me.
Absolutely. No, and I definitely hear that. Thank you. Chana? And then Dahlia, and then we're going to go further. Yeah, Chana? You're muted.
Everything that was said is correct. In this article, I take one exception. It says, no God. It's not true, because the Torah has a lot of commands about helping the widow, not for the widower, but for the widow. It was a word, and it still is probably in some way a man's word, but there is concern for the widow.
So that's true, but I'll tell you what I believe Professor Tribble is talking about here. There are a lot of people who compare Ruth to Avraham. How they leave their land and their birthplace and their family and they come to a new place. But where Avraham has Hashem say, I want you to go, and I'm going to make you great and give you a mighty nation and all that, Ruth has no direct promise from Hashem. Hashem doesn't tell her what to do, and Hashem doesn't tell her what she's going to get. In a sense, she's more like Sarah than she is like Abraham. she's not like Sarah either, but in this sense, she's more like Sarah than Abraham. And I think that's really what the message here is. There's no direct encouragement. There are laws, as you point out, that are designed to take care of the almanat, to take care of the widow, to take care of the stranger. All true. Okay, Dahlia, and then we're going to go on.
Okay, I just wanted, there was one sentence here that really resonated for me. One female has chosen another female in a world whose life depends on men. And I think Ruth is the only female in the entire Tanakh who chooses another female. So every other female, like even Devorah, she needs Barak. You know, like every female, you know, there were the women like Gaia who needed everybody who ends up being in a certain position, they all need a strong man to.
So that's interesting.
But the fact that she chose, and she knew that she's choosing a relatively powerless female, but there was such a strong belief in God and in Naomi's God that she chose a female. And I think that it's a unique.
Right. So I would make two notes. Ricky, I see your hand, but I'm sorry. I really do have to go forward. But I would say two things. Number one is in terms of Devorah. Devorah doesn't need Barak. Barak needs Devorah. Yeah. She doesn't need him. He's the one who says, "Hey, wait, you have to come with me." That seems to me what's going on in the story. Rebecca noted in the chat that she needs the Goel, she needs the Redeemer, but the truth is she doesn't at that point in the story. She doesn't even know about a Redeemer at that point in the story. She's not looking to be redeemed. She's on her own. Devorah is the only one, Dahlia, who I would say has an element of comparison to Ruth. When we learned Shoftim, I think I pointed out, Abarbanel makes a comment regarding Devorah that she is completely single. Meaning that she's the only woman in Tanakh as a protagonist who isn't known as the mother of this one, the daughter of this one, the spouse of this one, the sister of this one. Everyone else, all the other female protagonists in Tanakh, have a male relative with whom they are identified. And Devorah is the only one who doesn't. There's some debate as to whether Barak is her husband, but the text never says so.
Okay.
Right, but Lapidot doesn't mean the husband, right? That's all the commentators there say it can't be because we don't know who Lapidot is. There's more to be said about this. I'm going further. Ricky, I see your hand, but I really, really, really have to go further. This is, because of my computer, we lost the first 5 minutes. So I really want to make sure that we cover some ground. This was all a presentation of Ruth that's going to be, certainly sympathetic to as was said, a feminist perspective, although I don't think it's exclusively feminist. Take a look now at source number 2. This is from John Keats, Ode to a Nightingale. And my point is not the full poem or even the full excerpt that I brought here, but rather the description he gives of Ruth. Look halfway through it. Perhaps the self-same song, right, the song of the nightingale, perhaps the self-same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth, when sick for home she stood in tears amid the alien corn meaning grain. The same that ofttimes hath charmed magic casements, opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. It's a good thing that he had corn as grain, because otherwise it wouldn't have rhymed with forlorn. But the point is not the rhyme. The point is that Ruth captures the experience of those who are hurt, those who are abandoned, those who are just lonely, right? Her husband died. She loses her land. She goes to a new land where she lives in her mother-in-law's shadow. Even her child, when she has a child, is taken from her, right? She's going to have a child who's going to be known as Naomi's kid. There's an element of pain and loneliness in Ruth, which I think is easy to overlook when we think about the strength she displays, but I don't think it should be overlooked because I think that's another reason why people gravitate to her. So that's another element that I think is important. I've known quite a few women who converted to Judaism who adopted the name Ruth Not only because, well, Ruth converted and so did I, but because of this element of it, how she makes her way dealing with being alone in a new place. So that's another element. A third element of Ruth, the way that she is dedicated to assisting others. In source number 3, I brought you from the author Juan Valera. He's Spanish. And he's talking about imagining the ideal woman. And he mentions various virtues of women. And he mentions in source number 3, in his imagination about these women, I bestowed on them the sweet humility and the devotion of Ruth. Ruth, who is devoted to God. Ruth, who is devoted to her mother-in-law Naomi. She refuses to abandon her. She gathers barley for her. The child, of course, at the end, being essentially handed to Naomi. Ruth is somebody who is dedicated to others, and that is going to be a very important element when we look at the themes of the book as a whole and the goal of recording this book. That element of chesed, of acting for others, is going to loom large. So that's another element of it. But we're not done, because there's another dimension, which is destiny, the element of destiny here. Richard Baer Hoffman was an Austrian Jewish playwright. End of the 19th century, first half of the 20th century, died in 1945. And he wrote he wanted to write a biblical cycle of plays. And he didn't complete it. But one of them was about Ruth. And he has in this play a line, which I bring you here in source number 4, in which he imagines Ruth living to the time of her great-grandson, King David, and giving King David advice when he is beleaguered. So she says to him in the play, like God's stars circling in their assigned orbits above us, you, David, must complete your course here below, carrying on your assigned destiny. Ruth is associated with destiny. And certainly when you read rabbinic writing about the Book of Ruth, that comes through, where they talk about how Ruth was the granddaughter of the king of Moab and the ancestress of the king of the Jews, and all the different ways in which elements of her story play out to lead to ultimately the Davidic dynasty. She's a person of destiny. The Christian philosophers actually adopted Ruth. I didn't bring it here, but Blaise Pascal suggested that the Book of Ruth was preserved in Tanakh in order to teach the genealogy of the Christian Messiah. They took this destiny idea for themselves, which, like we've said before, they took a lot of things from us for themselves. So why should this be any different? But for all of these reasons, the strong female lead, the loneliness and abandonment, the assistance of others, the destiny, Ruth is such a compelling person. And the story itself is gripping. Take a look at source number 5, please. Professor Feivel Meltzer, I'm going to quote him a lot, I expect, over the course of studying Ruth, because he is the editor of the Dot Mikra volume on Ruth. Anybody know who his father was, by the way? You may have heard of him. His father was Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer. Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer, one of the great halachic authorities of the 20th century, wrote a commentary called Even HaEzel on the Rambam. So he is the son of Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer, and his sister married someone you may have heard of, Rav Aaron Cutler, as in from the Lakewood Yeshiva. So it's very interesting to imagine this sort of family dynamic here surrounding this. But Professor Meltzer, who I think was at Bar Ilan, it was either Bar Ilan or Hebrew U, says the following in source number 5, in talking about the literary quality of this book. He says, Kvaram du al kach, shekol hamidot shemanu chachmei hasafrut b'sipur tov kulan mitziot b'megillah zu. He says, they have already noted, they meaning general literary scholars, that all of the attributes that literary scholars have identified in a good story are found in this Megillah. And in the interest of time, I'll just read you my English translation, but you can see the original Hebrew here as well. Whether in the harmonious balance of the different parts of the story's structure, or in the description of events which evolve and are spiced with suspense, surprise, and calm as one, or in the personalities of the figures mentioned in the story as their deeds are examined, or in the lesson for future generations, you have all of these elements in the story which really carry it forward. And here I wanted to highlight something for you that a medrash brings. I'm using it, though, for a different purpose than the medrash does. Take a look at source number 6. Rabbi Chia's comment in the Yalkut Shimoni on Ruth. Amar Rabbi Chia, Kol Rashei Psukim Shel Ruth Vavin, Bar Mechet Psukim. All the sentences in Ruth begin with the letter Vav, other than 8 sentences. So 77 out of 85 begin with the letter Vav. The letter Vav means what? Sorry? And, right? And then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And Professor Meltzer notes in the introduction to Ruth that the 8 sentences that don't start with a Vav are in dialogue. They're in dialogue between people. So basically everything that's happening is either there's a conversation or the story is moving forward. So the story is a gripping story. It has a good flow. It has a good substance. And Ruth is such a compelling protagonist that the result of it is that, like with Megillat Esther, if we learn the story as children, we miss a lot of what's going on. It's too compelling. It's too good a story for people to read it in depth. And that's really sad, because there is a lot going on behind the scenes that we're gonna try to unpack here. A lot of themes to look at and messages. So what I want to do in our series is to understand the figures in Ruth, people like Ruth, but not just her. I want to understand Naomi. I want to understand Boaz. I want to understand Elimelech a little bit, but not too much. I want to get an understanding of who these figures are, the events that take place, obviously, the place of the book in Tanakh and its lessons for us. We're going to do more topics than line by line, just like with Esther, where we did more topics. So there'll be more line by line than there was in Esther, but not much. And I think I mentioned in a previous email or a previous class, I'm looking at 8 or 9 weeks basically for Ruth. So we're going to have 2 weeks before Pesach, and then and hopefully we'll wrap it up somewhere around Shavuot. That's the idea. Okay, clear so far? All right. So let's launch into the outline of the book itself. When does the Book of Ruth take place? I didn't mean time of year. I meant time in history. So it's not
the time of the judges.
Right. So Rebecca says, Janine says, the time of the Shoftim, the time of the judges. So that's the answer I always gave when someone asked me, because it's the answer that the book says, right? Take a look at sentence 1. This isn't hard. Vayhi b'mei shafot hashofetim. And it was in the days of the judging of the judges. Leave aside questions about whether it's the judges being judged or the judges are judging others. But that's simple, right? What's wrong with that answer? Why is that answer not adequate?
It's like you said, Megillat said, it's talking about it was in the days, so it's written, shows like it's written after.
So Chana is asking a question about when it's written, which is a good point, and we have to come back to the writing of it. That goes back to what Susan asked about Shmuel also. The story is before Shmuel's time, and as Chana notes, Vayhi bimei, because it's written later about what happened earlier, the period of the Shoftim. But that's not why I don't like the answer of it's written in the days of the Shoftim. My problem with saying that, yeah, Alina.
You asked when it's written, when it happened.
No, when it happened. Yeah.
And what wasn't included in the Book of Shelton then if it was part of that period.
Right. So one question that has to go with this is the question of if it happened during the period of the Shoftim, why does it get its own book? And I want to come back to that, that's for sure. But I have a fundamental problem. How long was the period of the Shoftim?
200 years.
Hundreds of years. 400 years, give or take. You couldn't do better to locate this book? Sometime in this 400-year period is when this happened, right? If you're a student in history and they ask you, I don't know, when was Canada founded, and you say sometime after the 16th century, you're not getting credit on the exam. What does that mean? It's during the period of the Shoftim. That's number one. And number two, you could give me better detail. You could tell me who the Shofet was.
I think it was Iftzan, no?
You think it was Iftzan. The Gemara Bava Basra thinks it was Iftzan, but then why didn't the book say so?
The question, because it would be, I think because of what transpires, you see, I think it would be a very negative message about the judges of that time, just in terms of what transpires. We could date it somewhat by the last sentences of the book because we have genealogy, so you can figure each of them lives X amount of time. The question is, does it really matter? Is the Vayivi made in the time of judges? Is that just setting the stage? Like, do we really have to set the actual time, or are we setting the stage for what transpires?
So it's an interesting question you put, but I don't understand why you bothered then to give a time that is not very useful. In other words, as you said, I could have done without this and figured it out based on the genealogy of David. And we're going to actually talk about that in a little bit. But
I would say we have it because because from elsewhere we say in the time of the judges everyone did what was, there wasn't leadership, which impacts on what transpires. Everyone did what was best in their own eyes kind of thing. That's why we end up with David with leadership.
Right.
That is more definitive.
It's milieu rather than time.
meaning?
What was going on at that time. It's kind of saying what Rebecca said, but it doesn't have to be identifying the time that it happened, but what was going on at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Times of the Shoftim.
So let me come back to the reasons for why it's left so broad in a few minutes. Let me first give the actual date for when the story takes place. But of course the answer is not one answer. The answer is there are multiple answers. There is one school of thought which is echoed in rabbinic writing in a few different ways, which says this story happened relatively early in the period of the Shoftim, in the period of the judges. Take a look, please, at source number 7, Midrash Root Rabbah. Midrash Root Rabbah is a relatively late canonized body of Midrash. You know that because the names of the sages who are here are names from late in the period of the Gemara, some of them, like Rav Huna, as an example, which means that you're not even quoting sages from the time of the Mishnah like you do in other volumes of Midrash. Rav Amar Barak Udvorahayu. Rav says, you want to know who these Shoftim are? When it says during the judging of the judges, Devorah and Barak. Now, we've just elevated Barak to become a Shofet, which is nice. We gave him smicha. But that's Rav's position. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Amar Shamgar ve'ehud hayu. Rabbi Yehuda ben Levi says that Shamgar and Ehud. Shamgar and Ehud are interesting because Shamgar is mentioned at the end of chapter 3 in Shoftim. Ehud is mentioned a little bit before. And we don't get a clear picture of when each died because of the way Devorah writes her song in the beginning of chapter 5 in Shoftim. I'm not going into all of it right now. The bottom line is we get a picture of there being overlap. So Rav and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi are looking for judges who have, for cases in which you have more than one judge at the same time, because it's the judging of the judges, plural. So one says, well, Barak and Devorah are at the same time. One says Shamgar and Ehud are at the same time. And then you also have Rav Huna, who says Devorah, Barak, and Yael. Yael, who may not have been Jewish, but apparently she could be a Shofet anyway. He says Devorah, Barak, and Yael. Why? Because it's Shvot HaShofetim. HaShofetim. So Shofet would be one judge. Shoftim, plural, two judges. HaShoftim, all right, that's 3. We got Yael. I'm not sure where he's going and why he's doing that, frankly, what's added by doing that. But whichever way you do it, that means that this is happening early in the period of the Shoftim, because Ehud is Judges chapter 3. He's the second of our Shoftim.
He killed the father.
Correct. Correct. Assuming that Eglon is the father, we're getting there. But that would be correct. So what you're saying is, the first Shofet, first of all, just chronology, because not everybody has learned the book of Shoftim. Yoshua is the leader for 28 years after the Jews enter the land. And then the next named leader after the elders of Yoshua's generation die out is Otniel ben Kenaz. And following Otniel ben Kenaz is Ehud ben Gera. And then you have Shamgar. So you're talking about something that's relatively early in this period of centuries. This will fit, and this goes to what Hannah was pointing out, this will fit with the idea that Ruth was the daughter of the Moabite king Eglon. If you take a look on your sheet at source number 8, the Gemara in Nazir, Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina said, Ruth bat beno shel Eglon melech Moab hayita. Ruth was the granddaughter of Eglon. Now, you actually have two different versions in the Gemara. You have versions that she is the daughter of Eglon. You have versions that she's the granddaughter of Eglon. Both of them show up in the Gemara. But the point is, Eglon was the king of Moab who Ehud killed. So that would suppose, again, unless Ruth is very, very old, which she could be, because people in Tanakh get to do stuff like that. But otherwise, what it means is this story is early in the period of the Shoftim. On the other hand, you have the Gemara in Bava Basra, which was already referenced, and I brought it for you in source number 9. Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna Amar Rav, Ivtzan ze Boaz. Here we have Rav quoted, not saying what he said in Ruth Rabbah, but rather saying Ivtzan. Well, Ivtzan is towards the end of the period of the Judges. He's right before Shimshon. So you're now going from, if you wanted to look these up in the book of Shoftim, the book of Judges, Ehud is chapter 3, Shamgar is the end of chapter 3, Devorah is chapter 4, chapter 5, and then you're jumping all the way to chapter 12 to find Ivtzan. And then chapters 13 to 16 are Shimshon, and then you have two weird stories at the end of Shoftim that are displaced in terms of their timing. So this is now jumping to the end of that period. We're going to talk about in chapter 2 whether or why the Gemara says Boaz is Ivtzan. Rebecca asks the question in the chat, which I've come to think of as Rebecca's question always, of why does this matter? The answer is it does, but we're not there yet. The speculation in particular related to Ivtzan becomes very loaded when we introduce Boaz in the story. It will determine whether Boaz is a good guy or a bad guy. The stakes are high in this one. Malbim actually thinks this is even later. And I was shocked when I read this comment in Malbim. I'm easy to shock, but I was shocked when I read this comment in Malbim, because one of the big questions that comes up when you learn the book of Shoftim is the question of whether there was always a Shofet, whether the Shoftim were federal authorities responsible for all the Jews or a particular tribe, how to understand leadership during this period from after Yoshua dies until the time of Shmuel. And usually, you learn Abarbanel's school of thought. Abarbanel is of the belief that judges are like kings, it's just not hereditary. So Abarbanel believes that it was judge, 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 judge in sequence with no gap in between. And these judges are really authorities over everybody. Well, Malbim in source number 10 says not so fast. And along the way, he places this very late in Shoftim, right before the time of Shmuel, when there was no single Shofet. And this is what he says. I'm reading my English translation in the interests of time. And it was in the days of the Shiput of the Shoftim. Shiput of the Shoftim, Shpot HaShoftim, when the judges were judging or being judged, however you want to read it. I rendered it as Shiput as opposed to Shafot because of how it fits in the ensuing sentence. This presented the reason that motivated Elimelech to leave Israel. He says the text, this goes back to our question of why the text orients us by saying it's in the period of the Shoftim. He says it's explaining why Elimelech left Israel. For it was in the days of the Shiput of the Shoftim, regarding which we find multiple times in the book of Shoftim. In those days there was no king in Israel. Each person did what was good in his eyes. I don't yet understand what Malbim is saying here. So if you don't, you're okay. It's the next line where he makes it clear. He says it's Shoftim plural because there was not an individual Shofet for all Israel, in which case the Shofet would lead the nation. For it was between one Shofet and another when there were many Shoftim. The willing would take action. There was no fear of the Shofet upon the nation. In other words, Malbim does not say this in his comments to the book of Shoftim. What he's saying is, during that period, you had times when there was a particular standout leader, and those are the ones who are recorded in the book of Judges, the book of Shoftim, and in between them, you would have many individual Shoftim, each one in their own fiefdom, who were governing. And this story, we're being told not the time period. This is why I like Janine's comment about the milieu. We're being told here that this is a story that's taking place when there was no single Shofet, but rather there were just multiple Shoftim running around in charge, and therefore no one was there to keep Elimelech in line and say to him, stay in the land. You follow? That's the idea here, is that it's orienting us to say it's during the period when, and he places it in the end of the Shoftim, but it's during a period when there is no leadership. Leadership is fragmented. Now, as has been noted, it also fits well with the chronology, if you put it late, it fits well with the chronology of David being the fourth generation from Ruth. Right? That's very convenient. It's a period from the time of Ivtzan until the time of David is basically 4 generations. It's about 100 years. So that works well. Interestingly, another support for this, if you were to look in the Septuagint, right, the Septuagint is supposed to be somehow based on the Targum Shiv'im, the translation of the Torah into Greek, although it's not the same work. But the Septuagint actually, in their order of books in Tanakh, puts Ruth after Shoftim. So they have Yehoshua, Shoftim, Ruth. That fits if this is supposed to be taking place at the end of the book of the, chronologically at the end of the book of the Shoftim. We're going to talk more about it being its own book. We're getting to that. But that's the idea. So in terms of when it takes place, you really have 2 options. Shortly after the time of Yehoshua, or shortly before the time of King David. Those are your 2 basic schools of thought. But I think the answer for why we're not specific, and we just say period of the Judges, is because it is meant to give a sense of what life is like at that point, particularly if you take this Malbim idea that the point is to say this is a period of lawlessness. And that will fit very well in the Midrashim that say it's not the time when the judges are judging, it's the time when the judges are being judged by the people. This is a period of lawlessness. That's what it wants to convey. So the text is not trying to orient me time-wise. It's trying to orient me to the story. That's the idea. Clear? Okay. So, basic outline of the book. Source number 11, I reproduced for you Professor Meltzer from his introduction to Root. He gives you a good outline of the events in the book. So for those who have read it before, just want a quick refresher, you can see it here. We start out with the whole family being in Moab, the death of Ruth's husband, Orpah's husband, the death of Elimelech, Naomi's husband, followed by Naomi saying, I'm going back to my land. Orpah and Ruth wanting to accompany her, Naomi dissuading Orpah from accompanying her, but Ruth insists. By the way, we're not going to have time to go into this, I think, at any point, but I just want to mention it because I thought it was really interesting from Professor Tribble's article. She points out, I think it was her, that, you know what, it may not be her. It may be Noam Tzion who says it. One of the two of them says that when Ruth insists on going with Naomi, she's actually breaking with Naomi. And Orpah, by not going with Naomi, is actually being loyal to Naomi, because Naomi says leave. So Orpah, who listens, leaves. Ruth stays, refusing to listen to Naomi. It's an interesting twist in the book. In any case, Ruth and Naomi arrive back in Beit Lechem. The whole city is in an uproar. What's happened to Naomi? She left here, she was wealthy and all that, and now she's downtrodden. And then the second chapter is harvest season, where Ruth ends up in the fields of Boaz, who turns out to be a relative of Naomi's husband Elimelech. Then you have the third chapter in which Ruth, as Rebecca already mentioned, encounters Boaz in the granary to ask him to redeem her. And then in chapter 4, Boaz manages the redemption at the gate of the city. Then you have the happy ending. The titles, by the way, are not my titles. These are the titles given by Professor Meltzer. So the happy ending in which Ruth and Boaz are married and they have a child, and then we get the lineage of King David. Okay. If you don't like any of the titles, it's not mine. It's Professor Meltzer. Okay. Authorship of this book, and we've already noted this, is credited to the prophet Shmuel. Source number 12, it's a Gemara in Bava Basra. That raises some very interesting questions, which are where I want to go next. One question, which I think someone has already asked, is if Shmuel wrote the book of Shoftim, the book of Judges, and he wrote the book of Ruth, and they occurred in the same time frame, why is the book of Ruth not in the book of Shoftim? Just tell the story along with all the other stories, right? And the answer is not that he had a 3-book book deal, and so he needed to make sure that he fulfilled the requirements to the publisher. The publisher wasn't born yet. That's number one. Number two, where in Tanakh, I already noted where the Septuagint puts Ruth, but where in Tanakh is Ruth, in the way we structure Tanakh, the way the Gemara structures Tanakh? Susan, sorry, you're muted. It's with the Megillot in Ketuvim. It's in the Ketuvim, in the writings. Tell me something. Shmuel wrote Sefer Shoftim, and it's in Nevi'im. Shmuel wrote Sefer Shmuel, and it's in Nevi'im. Shmuel is known as Rabban Shel Nevi'im. He is, leave Moshe out of the picture, the greatest prophet we ever had. Yeah.
This is the story about a prophet, though. It's a story about two women. It's a story about giving and all sorts of things. But there's no prophetic. I mean, we know that Ruth's going to be David's great grandmother, but there's no prophetic happening in this story. Whereas in Shoftim and all of that, there's a whole bunch of prophetic stuff going on.
So you could give the answer, and I think you're right, Susan, that we don't find prophets speaking to the Jews and conveying a message. Meaning in Yehoshua, there are times when there are beings who come to Yehoshua and give him a speech. And at the end of Yehoshua in particular, you find Yehoshua giving his speech about the future of the Jewish people and what they have to do right and what they should avoid doing wrong. And in Shoftim, we have the whole spiral in the beginning of the book and the opening couple of chapters which describe messages as well. So that's a fair statement. But it breaks down a little bit when you get to Shmuel and Malachim, which don't really seem to have prophetic messages of that variety. I mean, again, sort of here and there, but it's not so clear-cut. The normal split between Nevi'im and Ketuvim, between the prophets and the writings, is that the prophets, Nevi'im, are books written with a higher level of prophecy. They have, usually we say that Ketuvim is Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration, whereas Nevi'im is actual prophecy. But that just pushes the question back, because the author is a prophet. Why is it that the author does not write Ruth with that level of prophecy? That doesn't really answer the question. So in order for us to get there, to answer the question of why this book is not in Nevi'im, and to answer the question of why this book is not part of Shoftim, we need to understand what the purpose was in writing and canonizing this book. That's where we have to go, which we're not going to finish today, obviously. And the answer to the former question of why it's not in Nevi'im is actually relatively straightforward. But I think the answer to the question of why it's not in Shoftim is very, very important. I think it gives us a much better understanding of what this book is about. In the same way that when we learned Esther, we came to the insight that Esther is a book about Jews in exile. There's something here that we're going to see about this book that really changes, at least for me, the way I looked at it. So, in general, we have a basic rule for which prophecies end up in Tanakh. Take a look at source number 13. The Gemara says it. Harbei nevi'im amdu lahem liYisrael kiflayim ki yotzei Mitzrayim. Many prophets arose for Israel, double the number of Jews who left Egypt. I don't know if that means 1.2 million because there were 600,000 men of military age. I don't know if that means, well, there were 3 million Jews altogether, give or take, and so therefore 6 million people. Doesn't matter. The point is, an absurd number of prophets existed in our history, way beyond what we know of. Ela nivu'ah shehutzricha ledoros nichtava v'shelo hutzricha lo nichtava. That which was needed for all time, for future generations, was recorded. Otherwise, it didn't make it in. So when we look at the books of Tanakh, we see that the lessons for future generations can be from a range of types. Many of them use history to show how God deals with the Jewish people. Right? That's Yehoshua, that's Shoftim, that's Shmuel, that's Malachim, the Book of Kings. Some of them offer us direct exhortation. Be loyal to God. Right? Yeshaya, Yirmiyahu, Yechezkel, much of Treyasar, those 12 smaller books of prophecy. Some of them promise us there's going to be a time of Mashiach, an important message for generations. So Yeshaya does that, Yechezkel does that, Daniel does that. Some of them offer general guidance. This is how to be a good Jew, whether that's direct in terms of Judaism or just overall behavior. So think, the wisdom books, Kohelet, Mishlei, Proverbs. Some of them, according to Abarbanel, are meant to build loyalty to God. Divrei Hayamim, the Book of Chronicles, according to Abarbanel, is written to build not loyalty to God, loyalty to the house of David. He says Divrei Hayamim is meant to build up loyalty to the descendants of David HaMelech, of King David. Janine, you were going to ask? No? Okay. So what's the goal in canonizing the Book of Ruth? What lessons are we supposed to draw from the Book of Ruth? What would you say?
Well, the answer for the Talmud is chesed.
So one answer that is popular, that is offered, is that the answer is chesed. This is a book about kindness. And this is something which I didn't actually get up to it on the sheet, because I knew we weren't getting that far, so I didn't bother to translate it on the sheet. However, it's a medrash in Root Rabbah. It's not in the Gemara as far as I know, but it's in the second chapter in Root Rabbah. It shows up again in the 7th parak in Root Rabbah. That this is indeed about the value of chesed, but we're going to see a twist. It's not so much about chesed, it's about something related to chesed. So when we get, next week, obviously, it's already 2:26. So, but the language there in the Medrash is a little bit different. Yes, Ricky?
This has something to do with the question I've been wrestling with, especially since Shmuel wrote the book. Is this book a flashback to talk about David? Was Ruth canonized by destiny, or was she became destiny by her action because she wasn't directed by God to do what she did? It was her own action, and just like Esther's own action.
forget that. But this is what I'm wondering. Did she become canonized because her grandson was the king? Or was she already canonized before she even stepped forward to say what she did to Noah?
Good. So one theory is that this book is canonized in order to show, look where David comes from. Look at the greatness of David's ancestors. He comes from Ruth, he comes from Boaz.
Like a flashback.
Yes. Now, a twist on that. There was a period going back a couple of hundred years in which the secular critics argued that the Book of Ruth was canonized in order to have it oppose Ezra. Ezra said that the Jewish men who were married to Moabites had to separate from them. And here we see, no, the Moabite women are wonderful. Look at them. They're role models. The problem with this, which has been pointed out by various scholars and is basically rejected, caused the idea to be rejected at this point, is that Ruth is not projected as an example of what the Moabite women were like. The point is that she wasn't what the Moabite women were like, and she went and joined the Jews because she was a standout. So you can't tell me that this is an argument, a polemic, in favor of Moabites. That's not what this book is. Yes, Susan? But going back to your question, Ricky, the answer is yes. One school of thought we're going to see, which I'm going to actually offer a couple of layers in, is that this is recorded here anticipating David HaMelech, King David, and his line, but there's a little more to say about that. Yes, Susan?
Not anticipated because Shmuel
Correct.
anointed David.
Correct. Susan?
First of all, one of the things that my book says about that it says Moabite, not Moabite.
Yeah, we're getting there next week.
Okay, and the other thing is, was it legitimized? Because it's a little book, and it's got an important story. So if we don't put it in, it's not one of those books that are going to be kept like the
Apocrypha?
Yeah, or anything. So if we don't do something with the story and write it knowing Shmuel wrote it, then we would lose it. It wouldn't stand time the way it does now.
So it's an interesting idea. The only thing is that the only reason we have the Apocrypha is because of the church. Meaning we don't have Hebrew versions of the Apocrypha in the original. We have Greek versions.
It's the wrong example, but the idea being that we should keep it because on its own it wouldn't last.
It's an interesting idea. I think in order to really support that, we would need an example of a book that was small that they chose not to keep, and we don't have any examples because books that they didn't keep didn't last. So, it's an interesting suggestion. I just don't... generally speaking, we assume if something is in Tanakh, it's also ascribed sanctity. So it will be more than just we want to keep the story around, but there's a holiness to it. What I'm going to do next time, because it's already 2:29, is I want to look further at the goal of canonizing it. We're going to have two main schools of thought. One, that it's about the monarchy, and the second, that it's about God. And you'll see as it plays out how you can read each of those approaches into what's going on. And then we'll come back to our questions about how those impact the inclusion of this book in Ketuvim and its exclusion from Shoftim, from Judges. So we'll do all of that, and then it'll be time to start on the text, but probably that'll be what we'll cover next week, and then we'll break for Pesach if I had to guess. And yes, Rebecca, we're getting to the similarity to Esther within that as well. Sorry, yes, Janine?
We're looking for a reason for this, but there's a bit of a hodgepodge. I mean, Shir HaShirim and Kohelet, like they're different Megillot, they're not all the same. Esther is one. You could say Esther and Ruth may have something.
You're right. Each book has its own reason.
It wasn't Shmuel, was it, that decided to put them into Ketuvim? It was done much later by...
Correct. But it's not, that's what I said before. Each book has its own function. Yeshaya, Yechezkel, Daniel are teaching me about Mashiach. Kohelet and Mishlei are giving me guidance. Yirmiyahu is talking about loyalty to God. They each are different, and each of the Megillot is different. And in learning each of them, we have to ask, so why is this where it is? But Ruth has the special challenge. Ruth and Eicha are the only books to appear in Ketuvim which are written by prophets that I can think of.
Why is it called a Megillah? I missed that class. Why is it called a Megillah?
So we didn't talk about why it's called a Megillah. I think, if I remember correctly, the reason why it's called a Megillah has to do with the way we usually structure it on the parchment. But I actually want to look it up because I'm not sure my answer is correct, and now I'm wondering myself. I don't have an answer for you yet. Maybe I'll have one next week. We'll see. It's a good question. So thank you very much, everyone. I apologize again for the technical difficulties at the beginning, and look forward to continuing next week. Be well.
Thank you, Rabbi Torczyner.